In Georgian London, the tavern was a stage where every walk of life mingled under flickering candlelight. Gamblers staked their fortunes, poets spun their tales, and pickpockets worked the crowd. Tonight, we go there. The tavern's air was thick with the scent of tobacco and cheap ale. A crackling fire cast flickering shadows across worn wooden tables where gamblers hunched over their cards, eyes sharp and calculating. Poets whispered verses to ladies in fine silks, their voices a soft counterpoint to the clinking glasses and murmured conversations. Serving girls moved silently between patrons, their skirts brushing against the rushes on the floor, carrying trays laden with steaming mugs and platters of cold meat. The flickering candlelight cast deep shadows across the room, catching on the worn leather of a gambler's jacket as he shuffled cards with deft fingers. A poet sat nearby, his quill scratching against parchment, lost in the rhythm of words. The clinking of mugs and the murmur of conversations filled the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter or sudden arguments. Serving girls moved gracefully between patrons, their skirts swaying slightly as they delivered ale to thirsty lips. Each face was a story whispered into the night. A soft hum of voices filled the tavern, punctuated by bursts of laughter and clinking glasses. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the room. At a corner table, a lord whispered secrets to a serving girl, his voice low and urgent. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting the candlelight as she nodded, her movements fluid and silent amidst the bustling crowd. Nearby, a gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards, the faces of others around him tense with anticipation. The sound of footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor, mingling with the low murmur of conversation. A pickpocket moved gracefully through the crowd, his eyes scanning for a mark among the distracted gamblers and poets lost in their verses. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat and ale, while shadows danced across rough-hewn faces under the flickering candlelight. Serving girls slipped between tables, their movements fluid as they served mugs of steaming ale to patrons engrossed in heated debates or quiet whispers. The air was thick with the scent of ale and tobacco, a haze that clung to the rafters. A poet leaned in close to a serving girl, his words a whisper against her ear as she nodded, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. Nearby, gamblers watched their cards like hawks, their faces tense beneath flickering shadows. The fire crackled, sending warmth into the room and casting deep pools of light across the wooden floor where pickpockets moved with practiced ease among the patrons. The tavern's warmth enveloped all who entered, the scent of ale mingling with tobacco smoke. Shadows played across patrons' faces, casting deep pools of light and darkness. A serving girl moved gracefully between tables, her skirts brushing against rushes on the floor, delivering steaming mugs to thirsty lips. Nearby, gamblers shuffled cards under flickering candlelight, their eyes sharp and calculating. The air buzzed with hushed whispers and bursts of laughter, each voice a thread in the rich tapestry of secrets whispered into the night. The clinking of glass against wood echoed as a serving girl balanced a tray, her movements graceful and sure. Her eyes darted between patrons, noting the lord's eager glance and the gambler's tense fingers. A poet muttered lines to himself, his quill poised over paper. Shadows danced across the room with each flicker of candlelight, casting deep pools of darkness where pickpockets lurked. The air was thick with the scent of ale and tobacco, a constant murmur of secrets whispered into the night. The soft thud of a door closing echoed through the room, drawing eyes to a new arrival. The serving girl paused mid-step, her gaze flicking from the newcomer's sharp eyes to the lord who had risen to greet him. Candles cast long shadows across their faces as they spoke in hushed tones. Nearby, a poet scribbled lines feverishly on scraps of paper, his quill scratching against parchment in time with the crackle of the fire. The air was thick with anticipation and secrets, each word whispered into the night. The flickering candlelight cast a warm glow over the rough-hewn wooden tables where gamblers hunched over their cards. A serving girl paused by one of the tables, her skirts brushing against the rushes on the floor as she set down a steaming mug. Her eyes met those of a poet across the room, his quill poised mid-sentence. The air was thick with the scent of ale and tobacco, while shadows danced across patrons' faces, hiding secrets whispered into the night. The scent of cheap ale mingled with the sharp tang of sweat, filling the room. A lord's hand trembled as he laid down his cards, eyes darting nervously to a gambler who watched him with cold calculation. The serving girl moved silently among the tables, her steps light on the rushes, tray balanced with practiced ease. Shadows danced across the wooden floor, hiding the nimble fingers of pickpockets at work. A poet hummed softly to himself, his quill scratching out lines beneath flickering candlelight. A poet's quill scratched against parchment as he penned lines by candlelight. Gamblers' eyes darted nervously, fingers shuffling cards with practiced ease. Shadows danced across patrons' faces, hiding secrets whispered into the night. The serving girl moved silently among them, her steps light on the rushes. The air buzzed with hushed whispers and bursts of laughter, each voice a thread in the rich tapestry of secrets shared over cheap ale. The tavern hummed with life as a serving girl placed a fresh mug on the table, her eyes meeting those of a poet lost in thought. Candles flickered, casting shadows that danced across the wooden floor where pickpockets lurked unseen. A lord's hand trembled slightly, his gaze fixed on the cards held by a gambler with cold, calculating eyes. The air was thick with the scent of ale and tobacco, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared in candlelight. The crackle of the fire filled the room, mingling with the clink of glasses and hushed whispers. A serving girl moved gracefully between tables, her skirts brushing against the rushes as she carried a tray laden with steaming mugs. At one table, gamblers' eyes narrowed in concentration, chips clinking softly on warm boards. Nearby, a poet's quill scratched out lines feverishly, while shadows danced across patrons' faces, hiding the secrets they shared over candlelight and cheap ale. The sound of clinking glasses and hushed whispers filled the tavern. Shadows danced across patrons' faces as they leaned in close, sharing secrets over cheap ale and candlelight. A serving girl moved gracefully between tables, her eyes catching the flicker of flame from a nearby oil lamp. At one table, a gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards while a lord nervously watched his chips dwindle. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, each breath carrying tales whispered into the night. A poet's voice rose above the murmur, his words spilling out like liquid silver over cheap ale. Cards shuffled softly, a gambler's fingers swift and sure beneath the watchful eyes of a nervous lord. The serving girl moved with practiced grace, her tray balancing mugs that steamed gently in the candlelight. The tavern floor creaked underfoot as a serving girl made her way through the crowd. Her eyes caught the flickering light of an oil lamp, casting shadows that played across the worn wooden surface. A lord's worried gaze met hers for a moment before returning to his dwindling stack of chips. Nearby, a gambler's fingers moved with practiced ease, shuffling cards with a soft rustle. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and ale, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared in candlelight. The serving girl's skirts rustled softly as she navigated the crowded room, her eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight from nearby oil lamps. At a corner table, pickpockets whispered conspiratorially, their movements swift and precise beneath the guise of casual conversation. Nearby, a poet's quill scratched out lines feverishly on parchment, while gamblers' chips clinked softly on warm boards. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the tang of ale, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared in candlelight. The soft rustle of a serving girl's skirts faded into the background hum of the tavern. A lord's nervous fingers tapped against the warm tabletop, his eyes fixed on the gambler's swift shuffle. Nearby, pickpockets moved with practiced ease through the crowd, their movements masked by the shadows cast by flickering oil lamps. The poet's voice rose and fell like a melody over cheap ale, each word carrying the weight of secrets shared under candlelight. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the tang of spilled ale, every breath a testament to the night's unspoken truths. A soft murmur of voices filled the air as a gambler's dice rattled across a worn tabletop, their clatter mingling with the distant hum of conversation. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that danced along the rough-hewn wooden walls, transforming every face into fleeting silhouettes. In one corner, a poet leaned close to his audience, his voice weaving tales of love and lost fortunes over steaming mugs of ale. A lord's anxious eyes scanned the room, ever watchful for any sign of betrayal or triumph. The air was thick with smoke and ale as shadows danced along the rough-hewn wooden walls. A gambler's fingers moved swiftly over a deck of cards, their soft rustle mingling with the murmur of conversation. Nearby, a lord's eyes darted nervously around the room, his stack of chips dwindling with each hand. In one corner, pickpockets whispered conspiratorially beneath the guise of casual chat, while a poet's voice rose and fell like a melody over steaming mugs of ale. The night pulsed with secrets shared under candlelight. The scent of tobacco smoke and spilled ale lingered in the air, thickening with each passing moment. A lord's eyes flickered nervously as he watched his chips diminish with every hand dealt by the gambler's practiced fingers. In a corner, pickpockets moved silently through the crowd, their movements concealed by the shadows cast by flickering oil lamps. The poet's voice rose and fell in melodious whispers, weaving tales of lost love over steaming mugs of ale. Each breath seemed to carry secrets shared under candlelight. The clink of coins and the murmur of voices merged into a steady hum as a serving girl paused by a lord's table, her skirts brushing against his leg. He glanced up sharply, eyes narrowing at the flickering shadows cast by oil lamps. In another corner, pickpockets moved with practiced ease among the patrons, their movements barely perceptible beneath the guise of casual conversation. A poet's voice rose above the din, weaving tales of love and loss over steaming mugs of ale. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the tang of spilled ale, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared under candlelight. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the rough-hewn wooden walls, casting a warm yet uncertain light on the patrons. A serving girl moved quietly between tables, her skirts brushing against the legs of the seated men. Her eyes darted nervously as she delivered mugs of ale and refilled snifters of brandy. The poet in the corner continued his tale, his voice weaving through the smoke-filled air with a melodic cadence that seemed to carry every secret shared under the dim candlelight. A serving girl's skirts swayed gently as she moved between tables, her eyes darting nervously from the lord with dwindling chips to the pickpockets lurking in shadows cast by oil lamps. Her hands trembled slightly as she filled a mug, spilling a drop of ale onto the rough-hewn wood. The poet's voice rose and fell above the din, weaving tales that seemed to carry every secret shared under candlelight. Each breath was heavy with tobacco smoke and spilled ale, mingling in the thick air. The scent of stale ale and tobacco smoke hung heavy, a thick fog that clung to the wooden beams overhead. In one corner, the gambler's eyes gleamed under the flicker of candlelight, chips scattered like fallen leaves on the table. The serving girl paused near him, her fingers brushing against his sleeve as she set down a steaming mug. His gaze followed her movements, sharp and calculating, before returning to the game. The poet's voice drifted through the murmur of conversation, weaving tales that seemed to catch in the air like smoke. The clink of glasses and the murmur of voices merged into a constant hum, punctuated by bursts of laughter. A lord's eyes narrowed as he watched his opponent shuffle cards with practiced ease, chips stacked in neat piles between them. Shadows played across the faces of pickpockets, their movements fluid among the patrons. The poet's voice rose and fell, weaving tales that seemed to hang suspended in the air above steaming mugs of ale. Each breath was heavy with tobacco smoke and spilled ale, mingling in the thick atmosphere. The flickering candlelight cast deep shadows across the gambler's face, his eyes fixed on the cards he shuffled with nimble fingers. A serving girl paused near him, her breath catching as a lord nearby laughed loudly at some jest, the sound cutting through the murmur of voices and clinking glasses. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down another steaming mug, the warmth from the ale seeping into her palms. The poet's voice rose above it all, weaving tales that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The rhythmic clatter of dice echoed off the wooden walls, mingling with the murmur of hushed whispers and eager bets. A lord's hand trembled slightly as he rolled, his eyes fixed on the gambler across from him. Shadows danced around them under the flickering candlelight, while a serving girl paused near their table, her gaze darting between patrons. The poet's voice rose above the din, weaving tales that seemed to hover in the thick, smoky air like phantoms. The poet's voice faded into the murmur of conversation as a serving girl approached a table where chips lay scattered like autumn leaves. Her skirts brushed against the gambler's leg, and he glanced up, his eyes sharp beneath the shadow of candlelight. She set down another mug with trembling hands, feeling the warmth seep through her palms. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled ale, mingling in the dim light as patrons laughed and whispered around her. The scent of spilled ale and tobacco smoke mingled with the soft rustle of fabric as a serving girl moved through the crowd. Her eyes darted nervously, watching for any sign of trouble among the patrons. A lord's laughter cut through the murmur, followed by the sharp clink of coins on the table. The gambler opposite him watched intently, his fingers deftly shuffling cards under candlelight that cast flickering shadows across the room. The poet's voice rose above it all, weaving tales that seemed to hang suspended in the thick air like smoke. The serving girl's hands trembled slightly as she poured ale into a cracked mug, her eyes flickering between the lord who watched her with a predatory gaze and the gambler whose fingers moved deftly over his cards. Shadows danced across the rough-hewn wooden walls under the flicker of candlelight, while the murmur of voices and clinking glasses filled the air. The poet's tales continued to weave through the thick atmosphere like smoke, each word lingering before fading into the next. The clatter of dice and the soft rustle of fabric filled the air as a serving girl navigated through the crowd. Her eyes darted nervously, watching for any sign of trouble among the patrons. A lord's laughter cut through the murmur, followed by the sharp clink of coins on the table. Shadows danced across rough-hewn wooden walls under flickering candlelight, while the poet's voice rose above it all, weaving tales that seemed to hang suspended in the thick atmosphere like smoke. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the rough-hewn wooden floor, where patrons huddled in small clusters. A serving girl moved quietly through the throngs, her steps muffled by the thick wool of her skirts. Behind her, a lord's voice boomed with laughter, his words lost in the clinking of glasses and the murmur of eager bets. The air was heavy with tobacco smoke and spilled ale, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared over cheap liquor and candlelight. The murmur of voices and the clink of glasses filled the air. A serving girl's skirts rustled as she moved between tables, her eyes catching the flicker of candlelight on a gambler's coin-tipped fingers. Shadows played across rough-hewn wooden walls, where patrons huddled in clusters, their faces obscured by smoke and shadow. The poet's voice rose above it all, weaving tales that seemed to hang suspended like the thick tobacco smoke, each word lingering before fading into the next. The serving girl's footsteps paused by a corner table where the gambler leaned in, his eyes locked on the cards. Shadows danced across his face, revealing only fleeting glimpses of his expression. A lord's voice boomed nearby, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the soft rustle of fabric as patrons shifted in their seats. The poet's tales hung like smoke, each word weaving through the thick air before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and candlelight. The rough-hewn wooden floor creaked beneath the serving girl's feet as she moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning the patrons. A lord's voice boomed nearby, mingling with the soft rustle of fabric and the clink of glasses. Shadows played across the walls under flickering candlelight, where a gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards. The poet's tales hung in the air like smoke, each word weaving through the thick atmosphere before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and dim light. The scent of tobacco and spilled ale hung heavy in the air, mingling with the soft rustle of fabric as patrons shifted in their seats. A serving girl paused by a table where a gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards under flickering candlelight. Shadows played across rough-hewn wooden walls, obscuring faces, but not the tension etched into each figure's posture. The poet's voice rose above it all, weaving tales that seemed to hang suspended like smoke before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap liquor and dim light. A soft rustle of fabric caught the serving girl's attention as she moved between patrons, her eyes catching a lord's smirk in the flickering candlelight. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the murmur of eager bets, each breath carrying whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale. Shadows danced across rough-hewn wooden walls, where a poet's voice rose above the din, weaving tales that hung suspended like the dense haze. A gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards under the dim light, his eyes locked on the game as if the world beyond did not exist. The clink of coins on the table echoed through the tavern, drawing attention to a gambler's hands as they moved with practiced ease. The serving girl paused nearby, her skirts brushing against a wooden bench. Shadows from flickering candles danced across patrons' faces, revealing only hints of their expressions. A lord's voice cut through the murmur, punctuated by the soft rustle of fabric and the clink of glasses. The poet's tales hung in the air like smoke, each word weaving through the thick atmosphere before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and candlelight. The serving girl's eyes traced the flickering shadows cast by the candlelight, dancing across the faces of patrons lost in their own worlds. A gambler's fingers moved with practiced ease, shuffling cards under the dim glow. Nearby, a poet's voice rose above the murmur, weaving tales that hung suspended like smoke, before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and candlelight. The scent of tobacco and spilled ale mingled in the thick air, while shadows played across rough-hewn wooden walls, obscuring faces, but not the tension etched into each figure's posture. The serving girl's footsteps paused beside a table where a lord's voice dominated the murmur of eager bets. Shadows cast by flickering candles played on his face, revealing only hints of smug satisfaction. Nearby, a poet's tales hung in the air like smoke before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and candlelight. The scent of tobacco and spilled ale mingled with the soft rustle of fabric as patrons shifted in their seats, each breath carrying the weight of unspoken truths. The scent of stale ale and tobacco filled the air as patrons huddled around tables lit by flickering candles. The poet's voice rose above the murmur, weaving tales that hung suspended like smoke before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap liquor. A gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards, his face obscured by shadows cast from a nearby oil lamp. The serving girl paused, her skirts brushing against wooden benches as she navigated through the thick atmosphere. The soft rustle of fabric drew her attention as the serving girl paused near a table. A lord's smug grin flickered in and out of shadow cast by the candlelight, his voice low but commanding over eager bets. Nearby, a gambler's fingers danced with practiced ease, shuffling cards under the dim glow. The poet's tales rose above the murmur, weaving through the thick haze of tobacco smoke and spilled ale that clung to every surface. Each word seemed to linger in the air, mingling with the secrets shared over cheap ale. The scent of tobacco and spilled ale lingered in the thick air as the serving girl moved silently between patrons. Shadows cast by flickering candles danced on wooden tables, revealing only hints of the expressions etched into each face. A gambler's fingers deftly shuffled cards under the dim glow, while a lord's voice cut through the murmur with a smug confidence. The poet's tales rose above it all, weaving through the haze like smoke, before fading into whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale and candlelight. The serving girl's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she approached a table where a lord and gambler leaned in close, their faces barely visible under the flickering candlelight. The poet's voice carried like smoke through the tavern, tales of distant lands mixing with whispers of secrets over cheap ale. A pickpocket slipped unnoticed between patrons, his movements quick and precise. The air was thick with tobacco and spilled ale, each breath heavy with unspoken truths. The low murmur of voices and the clink of glasses filled the air as the serving girl moved through the dimly lit tavern. Shadows danced across rough-hewn tables, revealing only glimpses of patrons lost in their own worlds. A poet's voice rose above the din, tales of adventure and sorrow weaving through the thick haze of tobacco smoke. The lord's smug grin flickered in the candlelight as he leaned over a deck of cards shuffled with practiced ease by a gambler. Each word seemed to linger in the air, mingling with secrets shared over cheap ale. The scent of damp stone mingled with the acrid tang of tobacco as the serving girl sidestepped a spill of ale. Shadows from flickering candles danced across rough-hewn tables, revealing only fleeting glimpses of patrons lost in their own worlds. A lord's smug voice cut through the murmur, his words mingling with the gambler's practiced shuffling. The poet's tales rose like smoke, weaving above the haze of spilled ale and whispered secrets. Each breath seemed heavy with unspoken truths. The serving girl's skirts rustled softly as she moved past her lord, his voice low and smug over the gambler's cards. Shadows flickered across rough-hewn tables where patrons leaned in close, their faces almost obscured by the dim candlelight. A poet's voice drifted through the smoke, tales of far-off lands mixing with whispers of secrets shared over cheap ale. The air was thick with tobacco and spilled ale, each breath heavy with unspoken truths. A low murmur of voices swirled through the tavern like mist. The serving girl paused near a table where a lord's smug voice intermingled with the gambler's confident shuffle of cards. Shadows flickered across rough-hewn tables, revealing only fleeting glimpses of patrons leaning in close over cheap ale and whispered secrets. The poet's tales rose above the haze, weaving through the thick air like smoke from pipes and candles. Candlelight flickers across rough-hewn tables where patrons lean in close, their faces almost obscured by shadow. A lord's smug grin catches the light as he leans over cards shuffled with practiced ease by a gambler. The poet's voice rises like smoke, tales of distant lands weaving through the thick haze of tobacco and spilled ale. Each breath is heavy with unspoken truths, secrets mingling in the dim air. The sound of a spilt ale echoed through the tavern, drawing eyes to the serving girl who knelt to clean up the mess. Shadows from flickering candles danced across her face as she moved with practiced ease, avoiding the lord's lecherous gaze. Nearby, a gambler's fingers worked cards with deft speed, while a poet recited tales of distant lands in a voice that rose above the murmur of whispered secrets and the acrid tang of tobacco smoke. Each breath seemed heavy with unspoken truths. The scent of tobacco and ale hung thick in the air, mingling with the sweat of patrons. A gambler's fingers moved swiftly over cards, the sound of shuffling a rhythmic backdrop to the lord's smug laughter. Shadows danced across rough-hewn tables where whispered secrets were shared. Overhead, candlelight flickered, casting an eerie glow that highlighted the poet's earnest face as he spun tales of distant lands. The serving girl moved silently among them, her steps light on the worn wooden floor. The scrape of a chair against the wooden floor broke the hush. A lord's voice, smooth and low, carried over the table where cards were laid out like secrets waiting to be revealed. The poet's words, rich with imagery, floated above the murmur of patrons sharing confidences in the dim light. Shadows pooled under tables, and candlelight flickered across the serving girl's face as she refilled a tankard of ale, her movements practiced yet graceful. Each breath was heavy with the mingled scents of tobacco smoke and spilled liquor. The clink of tankards and the murmur of voices filled the air, a constant hum beneath the poet's tales. A pickpocket moved through the crowd, his eyes darting between patrons. Shadows from flickering candles danced across rough-hewn tables where gamblers laid out their cards like secrets waiting to be revealed. The lord's smug laughter mingled with the acrid tang of tobacco smoke and spilled ale. The serving girl refilled a tankard with practiced grace, her steps silent on the worn wooden floor. Each breath was heavy with whispered truths and unspoken lies. The tavern's air was thick with the mingled scents of tobacco and spilled ale, each breath heavy with whispered truths. A lord's laughter cut through the murmur as he leaned over cards laid out like secrets on a rough-hewn table. Shadows danced across the gambler's face, his fingers moving swiftly over the deck. Nearby, a poet recited tales of distant lands, his voice rising above the low hum of conversation. The serving girl moved silently between patrons, her steps light on the worn wooden floor, refilling tankards with practiced grace. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the worn faces of patrons, their eyes reflecting a mix of hope and despair. A serving girl moved through the crowd, her steps light on the creaking floorboards. Her hands were steady as she refilled a tankard with cheap ale, avoiding the lecherous gaze of a lord who watched from his shadowed corner. Nearby, a gambler's fingers danced over cards laid out like secrets waiting to be revealed. The poet's voice rose above the murmur, weaving tales of distant lands and forgotten heroes. Each breath was heavy with the mingled scents of tobacco smoke and spilled liquor. The flickering flame of a candle cast long shadows over the rough-hewn table where a gambler's cards lay like secrets waiting to be revealed. A poet, his voice weaving tales of distant lands, was barely audible above the murmur of patrons sharing confidences in the dim light. The lord's laughter mingled with the acrid tang of tobacco smoke and spilled ale. The serving girl moved silently through the crowd, her steps light on the worn wooden floor as she refilled a tankard with practiced grace, avoiding the lecherous gaze of a patron who lingered in shadow. The scrape of boots on wood announced the arrival of another patron, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. A serving girl with a knowing smile moved among them, her movements practiced yet graceful as she refilled tankards of cheap ale. Over the murmur of voices, a poet's rich words rose, painting distant lands in vivid hues. Shadows pooled under tables where gamblers laid out cards like secrets waiting to be revealed, their fingers swift and sure. The Lord's laughter mingled with tobacco smoke, thickening the air as each breath carried whispered truths. The sound of a tankard being set down echoed softly against the wooden floor. A serving girl paused, her eyes flicking to the Lord who watched from his shadowed corner. His laughter was a cold echo, mingling with the acrid smoke that hung in the air. Nearby, cards shuffled quietly as a gambler's fingers moved over them like secrets. The poet's voice rose and fell, painting distant lands in hues of gold and shadow. Each breath carried whispers of truth and lies, heavy with tobacco and spilled ale. The air hung heavy with the scent of tobacco and spilled ale, each breath a mix of smoke and shadow. A serving girl's hand steadied as she placed another tankard on the rough table, her movements practiced yet graceful. Nearby, a gambler's fingers danced over cards laid out like secrets waiting to be revealed. The Lord's laughter echoed coldly in the dim light, mingling with the poet's voice, which rose and fell, painting distant lands in hues of gold and shadow. Each whispered truth was carried on the thick air. The murmur of voices swirled like a mist over the tavern's worn wooden floor. The serving girl paused by a table, her eyes catching the flicker of candlelight on the gambler's cards laid out in silent challenge. Nearby, the poet's voice carried tales of distant shores and forgotten heroes, each word weaving through the thick air heavy with tobacco smoke and spilled ale. The Lord's laughter cut coldly through it all, a shadow lingering in the dim light. The scrape of a chair against the wooden floor broke the hush as a gambler leaned in closer to the cards spread before him. Shadows played across his face, revealing only hints of determination and greed. Across the room, the poet's voice drifted like a soft breeze through an open window, carrying tales of far-off lands where heroes walked among gods. The Lord's laughter cut sharply through the air, mingling with the acrid scent of tobacco smoke and spilled ale. A serving girl moved silently between tables, her eyes darting to avoid unwanted attention as she refilled tankards with practiced ease. The flicker of candlelight danced across the rough-hewn faces gathered around a table, their eyes fixed on the cards like they held fortunes or ruin. A serving girl's footsteps echoed softly as she navigated between patrons, her movements fluid and practiced. Above, smoke curled lazily towards the ceiling, mingling with whispers of stolen secrets and whispered dreams. The poet's voice drifted through the hazy air, painting tales of distant lands and heroic deeds, each word a thread in the tapestry of the night. The clink of coins punctuated the air, mingling with the soft murmur of voices. A serving girl paused by a table, her eyes catching the glint of candlelight on polished silverware. Nearby, a gambler's fingers moved swiftly over cards laid out like secrets waiting to be revealed. The poet's voice rose and fell, painting distant lands in hues of gold and shadow. Each whispered truth was carried on the thick air, heavy with tobacco smoke and spilled ale. The Lord's laughter echoed coldly, cutting through the haze. The sound of a latch turning caught the attention of those around as a serving girl entered with a tray laden with tankards. Her steps were light, avoiding the eyes that lingered too long on her figure. Near the hearth, a gambler's breath quickened over cards laid out like fates in the candlelight. The Lord's laughter, cold and cutting, mingled with the poet's voice, weaving tales of distant lands and forgotten heroes. Shadows danced across the room, swallowing secrets whispered between patrons. Each sip of ale deepened the haze that filled the tavern. The scent of stale ale and tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, a constant reminder of the night's passage. A serving girl's hand trembled slightly as she placed another tankard on a scarred wooden table, her eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit room. Nearby, a gambler's fingers fluttered over cards like shadows dancing under candlelight. The poet's voice, a soft murmur, carried tales of distant lands and